we've got animators, directors, writers, producers, musical geniuses all up here, and they're going to tell us where the big ideas come from. So let me get started. I'm going to ask questions, and whoever has an idea to answer, just jump on in. So, is there really such a thing as a new idea? Is there anything really new under the sun out there?
It's a good question. I'm going to jump in. We did 5 seasons of the Tom and Jerry show. We did a follow-up called Tom and Jerry New York, which kind of tangentially ran with the feature film. And then we did 2 direct to DVD. It was through home video with Warner Brothers, but I believe it's on HBO Max now. The thing is from working on Tom and Jerry, you had to, we really approached it as we had to really respect the history. We had like 80 years of some odd history. So there was a lot of homework initially, like watching a lot of the shorts. There's been so many different studios that have worked on Tom and Jerry in so many different styles. Our focus was on the MGM 1948-52 era is what we really wanted to honor, essentially. And so on a project like that, you know, this line of like, how do we make it original, but how do we pay respect to all that? Mm-hmm. So it's really about understanding the history of it, watching a lot of those shorts, kind of banking those ideas, and then bringing your own approach to it. So are there really new ideas? I think you can go and nitpick, and I don't know, it's just like that short, or right. This short is just like this short. But hopefully we brought something and modernized it, brought it to a newer audience, but yet again paid that respect. So to me, for the projects that I've worked on, are there any new ideas? Yes, there are new ideas, but most of it's based in something in the past.
All right, fair point. Good answer. Thank you. Any other responses to that?
I think along those lines, I wonder if, and I guess this is a question as much as a statement, I wonder if it depends. Like, it depends on the genre. Like, is there anything really new in sci-fi? Is there anything really new in fantasy? Is there really anything new in rom-coms? Depending on what category you're talking about, or like, potentially you could probably speak to this as well in music, you've only got 12 notes and then some semitones. Like, there's only so much to work with. So I wonder if it's more about, is there anything new narratively? Is there anything new character-wise? Is there anything new in terms of how you shoot it? Is there anything new in terms of how you edit it? I think if you drill down on the different elements of creativity, I tend to think there's nothing much new, but then again, like you said, it depends on how you package it, for lack of a better term. How you actually construct it, how you form it, and then how you present it to people depends on how they receive it. Like, there are a lot of variables that go into what makes a story a story. So depending on how you're giving it to people, maybe that's it.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, it's sort of my take on just storytelling as a whole is what can make it new or different or fresh is perspective, right? Like, we could all tell a very similar story or the same story, and it would be told in very different ways, which I think's part of the beauty of what we do. And what makes it fun and exciting is you're able to kind of put your fingerprints on it and sort of tell from your perspective what that story, you know, is going to potentially look like.
Yeah, I completely agree. Specifically for Warrior Nun, there's a lot of like women empowerment too in it. So I brought my unique perspective, my, you know, upbringing, every experience I've gone through. It might be more intuitive in how the music comes out, but that's my own unique perspective.
Very cool. Well, this leads me to my next question, because it sounds like what you're all kind of saying is there's a lot of really great ideas out there, and when you change them up and make them your own, that makes them new. So my next question is, how do you take one of those smaller, basic let's call it a starter idea, and make it a big idea?
Well, I'll jump in and say that, I think any idea, in a sense, is a big idea in the sense that when you're looking at a canvas, that the conception of the artist is filling that canvas or is opting not to fill that canvas, in which case even the empty space there is part of the artist's conception. When you're looking at a film and there's a running time, that entire running time comprises what that artist intended to put there, and in that sense, that idea fills the space and is sort of that big idea. A canvas doesn't have to be large to convey a big idea, and sometimes I think large canvases convey somewhat minute ideas. So I think it's craft. I think that an artist determines, here's a nugget, here's an idea, here's a concept. What do I want to make of this? What's that canvas? As a filmmaker, I think as a composer, I think as a playwright, I think as an actor with respect to developing a character, what do I want to confect from this? What is that big idea? And you might take something very subtle and then actually sort of zoom in and look at that and then amplify that to then fill sort of that canvas of the work you're doing. So at the end of the day, I think it's a decisiveness and it's craft that then works upon that concept.
Yeah, I agree. It's how you develop the idea. So in my case as a composer, sometimes I'll start out with a simple piano sketch with some early thematic material. So that's my starting idea. And then I go, okay, well, what instruments do I want to represent specific characters? Or how can I world build, my environment? Is there something in this environment that can be reflective in a specific sound or sonic palette that I can kind of use to expand upon my ideas?
I love the idea of world building within music. That's because what that tells me is, because most people, when they think of world building, they think of the characters or the, buildings. But to say world building in music, and I get it, is that any art can build a world, and that is really powerful. That is amazing. What would you say is an example of a really big idea, something that offers the best storytelling opportunities? What is a just amazing starting point? Maybe something from your career that you just saw the idea and went, I'm running with that. You had the idea, you woke up and went, this is the one I'm going to run with.
Well, just recently, and I think it was, a week or so ago, scrolling on the gram, there was actually on Quelly TV, which is I've never really watched that much of it, but it's a relatively new station that has a lot of different kinds of content. And it's very culturally specific to African American, Afro-Panamanian, Afro-Latino, Afro-African content. And they had something on there that was, I think it was a werewolf, it was a series based on a werewolf historical narrative story type thing, but based from Haiti. And so I started doing a deep dive because I said I didn't know that Haiti had a narrative history of werewolves, so let me look into this. And they do. And it's very specific, it's very different from anything that it's not Werewolf by Night, let's put it that way. So when I was checking it out, I thought, this is different. It's a familiar idea, but it's a different kind of concept, and the way that it functions in that narrative world is very, very simple. It's not a complex story, which leads me to the idea that big ideas don't necessarily have to be complicated. The implementation of it, or let's say when you build it out to actually present to people, it might get more complex and necessarily needs to if you're thinking about doing a franchise or something. But from a marketing standpoint, I look at it and I go, this is real simple. It's real easy to explain to people. It's really easy to break down. The headline is very concise. That's the most recent big idea that I've encountered that I thought had the most potential to reach a great number of people with something new, wrapped in something familiar, but based in something new in terms of the storytelling. I'd say that's mine.
Yeah, I think to kind of piggyback on that, one thing I think super important with, air quotes, big ideas, but is execution. Like, that's one thing that, especially in our business, especially in just a bunch of different genres and different disciplines, is important to consider, because you can have a germination of an idea, and it might be from a song you hear on the radio, or it might be a billboard you see, or it might be, can come from all these different places, and you're probably going to approach it from like your designated craft for lack of a better way to put it, and find that that's maybe kind of your angle into the story. But if the entire thing is going to take, place in space and you can't afford to execute that, or you can't really pull off, the visual effects you want to tell that story, how can you find a way to that, into that big idea and still tell the story you want, but have it resonate and have it be marketable and have it be something that people can see? Because, yes, there is a business side to telling stories, especially with what we do, and so it's not the fun part, at least for me, but it's an important intersection. And so I think finding a way to kind of reverse engineer your big idea so that people can see it hopefully leads to more funding, more eyeballs, a season renewal, more toys to play with. Again, not always the sexiest side of the business, but I think it's important because it gives you more freedom for me, it's self-expression, right? It gives you more opportunity to tell the stories you want to tell. So it's something, it's a small percentage, but it's something I consider when I'm trying to flush out an idea is, can I shoot this in the time and budget that I think I can get for the project?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on that too. In animation, especially in episodic television animation, budgets are tight, so schedules are tight. And a key word that you used was execution, because it's animation is a hugely collaborative effort. So from the big idea or the idea from the writer to the storyboard artist to the editor, where I come in, it's hugely collaborative, and it's a back and forth effort too. It is a back and forth effort before the world turned upside down with the pandemic and whatnot. But when we were in house, what was such an advantage I felt to the creative process, and to stay within the confines of an incredibly demanding schedule, it was to be able to, if there was an issue in storyboards that, let me backtrack a little bit. I'm fortunate enough at Renegade, what we do is I cut the storyboards, and I also cut color when color comes in. So I know the show. So some studios, specifically Disney, I think breaks that up between their Leica editors and their color editors. Warner Brothers, I think, keeps it together. We keep it together. It's the same editor that works on that show. And I think that's a huge advantage, just from a storytelling point. But to go back to the storyboard process, when I'm cutting a storyboard, it can come in different ways. It could come in as just traditionally like individual panels, and that's where I'm putting it together. I'm actually cutting this thing and putting it together. Technology's kind of changed that, and sometimes we give a little bit of that to the board artists. They will be working in Storyboard Pro. They can actually time it out. So they're taking the writer's vision, and then they're interpreting that script, and then I'm receiving it and then remolding it. So one of the points I wanted to get back to is execution, and it's kind of the way I pictured it. It's almost like a sculpture, right? You keep working at it, but you have to do it in a timely fashion, because sometimes you don't have a second chance to go back. So it's like, first time, really put your best. You've got to execute, and you've got to bring your best effort. Whatever that is. If it's the minute kind of mechanical editing to make sure an edit actually works, or if it's the overall piece. But I think that, again, I'm just trying to buttress off of what you were saying. It's with budgets and execution, and just in television, are just incredibly critical to put out a good product, but also to hold the vision of what the writer wanted.
Yeah, and it can turn into your superpower for your project, right? Because at the end of the day, regardless of if it's a $250 million budget or a $2 budget, like you have a budget. So you're going to use all of your time and money and energy to tell the best story you can, or tell it in the way you want. And I have to imagine, I know you've done a lot of micro budget films you mentioned, and it's like, I have to imagine you take efficiencies you have in that to projects you're doing now, right? To just you don't at least for me, I don't take the foot off the gas just because I have more time and money. I'm still going full throttle. I just get to spend more time and money on the things that are important to me. And,
Correct. Yeah.
I think if you come up that way, and I was a big fan of doing 48-hour films, where it's like you have a sandbox and you have 48 hours and you have a product when you're done, and it's not always exactly what you want, but you've done it, right? And I've taken things I've learned in that and just use them on bigger budget projects. And I think I'd rather lean into that than go, oh, you know what, I don't have enough time or money. It's like, how do I solve this problem to use what I do have? Because I feel fortunate that someone's gonna invest in me, to tell a story.
It sounds like there's the original idea, there's the developing the idea, and then there's the reality of executing the idea word that we've all used.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the on the television side of things, the sad reality is like, you have the could be betters, right? In animation, that could be better, but the clock is ticking. This show is due. So, when you, I made the mistake of going on IMDb and looking at reviews of my show, and I was just like, but if you only understood, if
Never
you
do
only
that.
understood,
Don't do
Never
it.
do
we
that.
didn't have time. Our show, specifically Tom and Jerry, was very difficult because, again, we really wanted to kind of save that lineage of the MGM years, the sweet spot of the MGM years. But budget doesn't allow us to hand draw that. All those shows were hand drawn, just beautifully drawn. And there was a certain style to it too. They had very, very snappy animation, but animation is a lot about poses. So how do you get into that pose? You can ease into that pose and ease out of that pose, and you can overshoot that pose, which is more Tom and Jerry style. It's not a Disney style that has what I would consider almost an unlimited budget at times, where there's meticulous in-betweens drawn, and they have so much time to kind of sculpt this thing. We didn't. And it's all done on desktop. Our Tom and Jerry was primarily done with Flash, which is better known as Animate, an Adobe product. So it's a completely different approach to things are hand-drawn initially. You have a library, but the animator picks and pulls from the library to build the scene. And again, because of time constraints, how much can you actually pour into a scene? It becomes a challenge. So those shots would come back to us. And working with the director, Daryl Van Sitters, who's just, I've been incredibly lucky to work with. It's sweet. Renegade's a bit under the radar. You probably don't know his name, but just an incredibly talented animator and director, and that being able to sit in the room and kind of just absorb all his information. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Anyways, so we would get animation back, and oftentimes, we would call just hitting the marks, because the animator, it's not even the fault of the animator. It's like everything, again, is about execution and budget. Sometimes that execution suffers, unfortunately. The harsh reality is it suffers. And what I'm able to do in the editing room is not just timing and story, but with that kind of traditionally looking flat animation, I have the ability to hold poses, to retime things, and to really kind of, again, mold the piece. So you have the overall story, you have the granular kind of mechanics of it, but you also have within a shot molding and reworking the timing and trying to, again, the ultimate thing is to trying to get to that idea, trying to get to that story.
Exactly. Excellent. Excellent thoughts right there, for sure. So speaking of story, here's a little challenge for everybody. What, in your opinion, are the most important elements of a good story? I've got some options here. Narrative, characters, conflict, world building, the rules of the world. What are the most important elements? Or something that
I was like, we just got to pick one?
you
Character and conflict, I'll pick my two.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Character and conflict.
Character
that'll
and
be my
conflict,
two.
love it.
Well, I love that everything should hopefully work together simultaneously, because you can reach a wider audience that way. Everyone has their preferences on what they look for most in a good story. Maybe it is the world building, the character development, other elements like that. And for me, I think what makes the best story is when you're serving your characters and you're serving the story in the end. You're telling the truth of these characters and of the story. And specifically for Warrior Nun, Simon Barry, our showrunner, had an amazing idea to build a theme for Ava and Beatrice in season 2. But when he told me, I want to build a theme for Ava and Beatrice and their relationship, I want it to grow naturally throughout season 2. I don't want to push anything on our audience. So that's something I did. I made sure that I sprinkled their theme throughout season 2 so that by the end, the relationship came into full fruition and that it felt natural and that it felt earned.
Clever.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of revert back to what we were all discussing earlier, I think, it's not one of the answers, but I think execution, I'll say it again because it was brought up earlier, but, and a big part of that is a big idea doesn't mean it's a complex idea. So I think I would, long ago I used to err on the side of thinking that complexity, I want to make the next Sixth Sense or the next Usual Suspects because that was an amazing, clever twist. I couldn't, and don't get me wrong, those are incredible movies, right? But I just sort of got lost in complexity, and I think I've just been able to tell more stories better or had more recognition and more people watched things that were executed well as opposed to being like clever or tricky. And of course, there's I love a good twist, and there's a space for that. But I think, like you were saying, it can be any of those things. But if they work in orchestra, like that's what I'm aiming for: is how is everything firing on all cylinders to execute whatever that big idea is. And I think it can be approached from any direction. I mean, I personally like to have music before I go and shoot or write anything because I like to write to that. It's not always the case. It's not always how I do it, but to your point, it's like that can be a massive, it is a huge storytelling element, and if you're working toward that, and that's where the big idea came from, your movie can be like one giant music video, which to me is exciting. Again, what's exciting about the craft, you can approach it from so many different directions, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about that because if you have all these things working together, you totally expand your audience. Like one person might love fight scenes. One person might just really love the love element of a story. So if you can kind of hit all those points, you just reach a wider audience.
I think also I think filmmakers, like artists from various media, create for different reasons as well. There's some filmmakers, I think composers as well, that their concern is to really be true to what's within them. Are there any artists out here? I'm curious. Yeah, great. So.
Oh, raise that hand. Raise it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An artist, of course, has a vision, has an impulse, and there's some artists, and in film this might be an Andrei Tarkovsky, for example, if you're familiar with the late great Russian director, whose aim was to simply be true to the vision that was birthed in him without respect to how it connected to the audience. He said if it finds an audience, it'll find an audience. But he was fulfilled and satisfied. In fact, there are many interviews in which he speaks against a sort of pandering to the audience. But he was faithful to what was in him. And we find this in music, particularly a lot of contemporary composers, for example. And so that's one sort of sphere of endeavor. You want to be true to what's within you. But there are many of us as artists who do want to connect with an audience, actually. We're satisfied, as in conversations, as in discussions, when what we are birthing actually finds resonance someplace else. And I think to oversimplify it, I think then, there are these elements, there's narrative, there's story, there are these various components we can talk about in terms of what goes into then crafting this thing that we're building. But I think that you need to ask, how does this connect with, why should they care about what I'm creating right now? Why should she or he care about that? And I think that gives birth into thematic sort of birthings. John Williams is really beautiful he's of course a master craftsman, of course, and he was orchestrating other people's works. He orchestrated Fiddler on the Roof back in around 1970. But he had a way and has a way of creating themes in music and motifs and journeys that just enwrapped you, right? And so I think that's it. And then, of course, that could play out in terms of characterization. Okay, then who are these characters that I want to invite my audience to journey with and to care about journeying with them? And what are the circumstances then that bring this and that out of the character? How elaborate do I want to make that? By the way, I want to touch on something else that was talked about here, and that's the sort of conflict and tension between, let's call it the producer and the director, the money and the artist.
Right. Yes.
I really think that when engaged in a robust way, that can really produce real beauty, because necessity is the mother of invention. And as a filmmaker, I can tell you that so often I've had to think to myself, okay, I've got my story here, this is what I want to tell. And of course, you create your stories in the abstract. You're in an office, you're in a cave, right, in front of your computer. There's no one else around. You're in your own universe. But of course, that's not where projects and products live. They live out there. So when you then expose them to the money, the question's always, can you do this more effectively, more efficiently? Can you make this more poignant, actually, and do more with less? And this is where you begin to say, you know what, if I actually merge these characters into one, this will be a more powerful character than splitting these narratives into 2 or 3. If I were to, at the end of American Beauty, the film, they ended up cutting out the entirety of Act 3. That was a post-production act. But they ended up realizing the story was more powerful, actually, by consolidating the film itself after it had been shot.
Yeah.
So these are sorts of wonderful discussions that can happen and processes that I think can create a more poignant story at the end of the day if you engage it constructively.
No, there's a lot of truth to that, absolutely, in that all throughout the process, that those kind of limits that you're put make you in a lot of ways more creative. And I think an example that's just popped into my head, I think it was Josh Wheaton that said his Firefly show, when he found out it was canceled and they only had X amount of shows left, like all the other stuff was like, only do the important stuff. Like, I need to tell the core of this story to finish this before our show is done. So that reminded me of that. But what you said is very, very true. It can actually be a positive. It can actually be a positive in that all throughout the process, within storyboards and animation, and in the animation and in the editorial and the storytelling. So.
If the money doesn't bear down too heavily and oppressively. So there's this.
Yes, there is that.
So there is, yeah. Got to kind of put up your shield as well, but yeah, allow some incursion.
Yes.
I know to these points from the marketing side, there are always certain, like, creatively, it's like, is it conflict, is it characters, is it narrative? The marketing department generally has like 5 questions, and it doesn't matter what the genre is, it doesn't matter what the project is, it doesn't matter who's doing it. Those questions always revolve around who's it for. Yeah, we care about the money, and I think this is changing slightly, I hope. Speak on it. If not, there's more of a notion, at least in smaller projects, that anything can be marketed to anybody. It's just a matter of how you do it and how clear you are about what it is you're marketing. So anime in this country is something very different from what it was, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. I remember talking to people maybe 15 years ago who thought anime would never take off in this country. Anime didn't change, but people's response to it changed. The way it was marketed changed. The way people consumed it changed because things became more digital and they were able to get access to things they didn't have access to before. When you were talking about the financial situation, I think it was the first Underworld movie, and the director was saying that there was some huge thing he had to build into the side of this mountain, and he couldn't do it because they didn't have the money for it. So he had to do it a different way, and he's like, oh, it ended up being so much better. Now, maybe he was BSing because it didn't turn out the way he wanted. He had to make it sound good. But when I saw it, I thought, it does look really cool. I'd be curious to know what would have happened had you had the extra $700,000 to do something else practically. But all of that being said, the conversation can happen, and it's not necessarily a contentious one. I think it just has to be clear. And when I've seen it run into issues in terms of actually telling the story the way the story is intended to be told is when both sides aren't clear. When somebody says, oh yeah, well, we can work with that budget-wise, and they can't. Or the creative person says, oh no, we can come in on time with this, and they're in their mind thinking, how can we actually make this work because I just lied. I think the more connected people are, and this comes back from experience in music, being an artist and repertoire and everything, do what you want to do. Absolutely. Take your creative thing and put it out there, but just let's be very closely intertwined from the beginning all the way through about how, speaking of execution, about how we're actually going to make this happen, because from the marketing standpoint, when it's done, I need to be able to plan how I'm going to make this land with people who might be interested in it. And if we're not clear from the beginning, then that story that we have to tell about this creative product at the end will be really messy.
Yeah. What's beautiful, by the way, is along those lines, that process, thinking about the big idea, and thinking about film in particular, and thinking about that mountain. I didn't know that anecdote. But what's interesting about film is that at the end of the day, in the editing process, and this is just for those that might maybe filmmakers here, this already. But for those that are not filmmakers, the last stage, of course, of filmmaking is post-production, and that's when the elements come together. You're actually, you're editing the film, and you're bringing in the music, and you're mixing, and that's where probably most intensely the idea is, let's get back to the big idea. Let's prune away everything that actually impedes the telling of the story and the clarity of the story. If you were to watch A Beautiful Mind, an amazing film directed by Ron Howard, and look at the behind the scenes and the deleted scenes, there are an enormous number of deleted scenes in A Beautiful Mind. I mean, they thought at the front end that these scenes were all necessary to convey the big idea, and they hacked out an enormous number of scenes to get actually to chisel away at that big idea. And at the end of the day, of course, the big idea is shown beautifully in that movie. So it's kind of also, you can, on the front end, you can stand and project and say, this is what we need to do, but there is a process that needs to play out, and other voices and experts and editors and composers, and I mean the whole, for Frozen, the entire character, the characters change because of what the songwriters brought to bear in that. So it's a process, and you have to sort of give yourself over to the process as well and engage that process, so that at the end of the day, when that final screening happens, the audience says, I got that big idea, I've got it. And that's what we're all, I think, striving for in our respective media.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about that, the big idea. A lot of times for me as a composer, I love to get involved early with the scripts, because that informs a lot of my decisions. And sometimes questions that you may have about the story can easily be answered in the script. Sometimes if I have a question, I'll go back to the script, and a lot of times my answer is already right there on the pages. So yeah, the scripts help me out immensely. And if you're a composer, I do recommend really diving into those scripts.
It probably sounds obvious, but everything has to work together in service of a thing. So if you're composing and you're writing about, let's say you're doing a scene regarding a certain character, where that character is at that point in the story, if you're using, let's say, a leitmotif, which, for those who don't know, is a musical theme that always happens when a certain person shows up. It's major when they're happy, it's minor when they're sad. It sounds real simple, but if
You
everything...
just said major and minor.
I don't know. But it's like it doesn't, or how it's edited. Like if an actor is giving 3 or 4 different takes on a certain scene, whichever scene you pick and however you cut that scene determines how that person's character arc is being viewed by the audience, because you didn't pick the one where they were laughing, you picked the one where they were straight-faced. Or if you're writing, like you're writing a movie, how do you take a character from a certain place to a certain other place with everything being earned, so they don't just show up there, but you can see the process through which they got there. And especially with the stuff you do, so much of which is like, he's about to leave for Scotland in about 6.5 hours for some, on home on the range kind of stuff. I'm like, how do you even craft a story and you don't know what's going to happen? Like, you get there, you have an idea about what is going to happen, but that's only because you know the terrain you're going to. How do you actually, when it's all finished, put together the story of this happened and this happened and this happened and make it land with an audience a certain way? If everything doesn't work together, then it kind of doesn't matter how good your characters are, how good your story is, or how detailed the world building and the rules are. If you don't tell the story in an earned, organized way so that people get it, what's the point?
And there's so many moving parts to that too, and that's why the directorship is so important, because you've got you're conveying your big idea through music, through effects, through sometimes animation, through casting, choices actors are making in the moment when you're on set. What are the beats within an actor's reading during the course of this? Your production design, your costume design, your cinematography, and all of these things are working together, and they all have contributions to make. And so, as, for example, the director, what you've got to do is decide on the most sort of delicious way of conveying what that idea is within this scene, which, of course, is then serving the bigger picture as well. I recall during the featurettes of The Lord of the Rings, and Gimli, the character played, he's a dwarf in The Lord of the Rings, and the screenwriters had written a large backstory for him. So you understand who this dwarf is. What's his backstory? Tell us about yourself. And they realized during production that by beholding the artist portraying Gimli, great artist, that, you know what, he exudes enough of who this person is that we can slash all that dialogue. But those are decisions that are made on the fly, and you've got to be very mindful of calibrating all of these things, again, to convey that idea to the audience. And music, just, it's an incredible aspect of that.
Yeah, that's a great point, being mindful of other elements. Sometimes I had to be mindful about whatever I'm seeing on screen. I know that there's going to be a lot of visual effects and CGI in this scene, so I know I have to make it even bigger. If something is going to be transforming, I don't want to give spoilers, but certain things that transform, I need to, if I had read the script and I'm reading, the little notes on screen, I would know, that I have to build things up or swell even more on certain time codes to take that into account, that it's going to be much bigger than what I'm actually seeing.
Yeah, a lot of us visual effects people try to get rough versions to the composers early for exactly that reason. So I've got one more question. It's a small one, easy. If you were going to start with an old story, because one of the topics today is narrative sources. Western versus non-Western, African, Hindu, Chinese, indigenous. How would you pick one, and how would you take it to become a story you could tell today? Just a little question.
Yeah, I knew that one was going to be scary. when you said that.
I could start with that. Specifically in Warrior Nun, there's a lot of nods to the Middle Ages. So there's also one specific torture scene where a character is sitting in the iron chair, I believe is the name. So it's an iron chair. It's a torture device in the Middle Ages. There's like 100 spikes. So I wanted to use certain instruments that can kind of pay an homage to that. Like I used a hurdy-gurdy, but my way of turning that into a more modern approach while still maintaining that instrument was I pitched it down by like 3 octaves or so that it would give a more ominous, drony quality to the ambience almost. And to also give a more modern approach, I took barbed wire and bowed that aggressively to kind of add something creepy
I've
to
got
the,
to hear this.
Right, me
to the
too.
scene. And then there's another character, Lilith. For her, I wanted to play with the word contrast a lot because she goes through a pretty transformative experience in season 2. So I used a lyre, a more ancient harp instrument, and for her, when she's kind of reflecting on her past, I played that traditionally, like plucked with my fingers in a more ethereal space. And then when she starts going through her transformation, I start bowing it aggressively. So it's my way of still maintaining certain instruments, but taking a more modern approach with them.
This is why, from a picture standpoint, from a picture editor standpoint, leave time for the composer.
Or get them involved early. I think that's also very helpful to start early.
Well, and I think just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, one thing for me that I enjoy about storytelling, I think is sort of I don't know if it's our job or duty, but I think when it works well, it works very well, is to make a lot of these things somewhat invisible to somebody who's, enjoying the story, whether it's, and that can be anything from a movie, film, TV show to even like a podcast or a radio show, right? But I think, our job is to do our research and find elements that resonate with us, whether it's an instrument that comes from the times you're trying to represent, or it's cultural, or it's, anything that's relevant to how you want to tell that story. And it's a little bit of a magic trick, right? So you're trying to evoke emotions from people that are consuming it, and a lot of times, at least for me, the hope is they don't really know how or why you did it. They just know that it makes them feel a certain way. So I think that's a good way to sort of mix things that are contemporary and things that have cultural relevance and things that can happen in different times and eras and parts of the world is, if it's resonating with you and you've done all these, micro decisions that lead you toward what your final product's going to be. I mean, a big part of it was touched on earlier, where it's like lots of scenes get cut, lots of things, you spend time and money going down a certain avenue and it doesn't work out, but that's part of the process. It's an important part of the process because it gets you to where your end result is. And a lot of times I would rather know something didn't work out than wonder about it. So.
In terms of sourcing stories, and this could just be where my head is as of the last year or so, I tend to go real old, number one, because it's public domain IP and I don't have to deal with anybody. But also because I have found, again, just me, I've found that the older the story is, the easier it is to update, or the easier it is to bring current. The more recent a story is, let's say the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years, the more topical it is, but topical as in current time, as in current issues. You go way back to a project I'm working on right now is based on the metamorphosis of Ovid, so it's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. That's real easy to update, very, very easy. And it's very easy to update in pretty much any, you can go, I wouldn't say rom-com because she dies, but you could go.
What if it happens in a funny way?
I know, yeah, exactly. Like she tripped off something. I don't know. But it's easy to take that in a number of different directions. It's easy, as I did, to flesh out the role of Eurydice because she didn't have a lot to do in the original. And musically, it's easy because there's also a music composition element to it. It's easy to take it into a different area than I would normally think. So part of it's opera, part of it is house music, part of it is dance music. Like it's really easy to do that. For that and other practical reasons, I tend to want to go old, whether it's ancient Greek and Roman, whether it's African, the way African mythology now bolsters, as people are discovering, Afrofuturism and all those types of things. It's just easier to pull it apart and put it back together for me.
Yeah, I think from specifically on the Tom and Jerry stuff, we had an advantage of that. It's exactly what you're saying. We could take those old ideas, modernize them, bring certain aspects of that forward, and bring it to a more modern, current day audience. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer the question specifically, other than we just did a Western and we just did a holiday film. So I don't know. Maybe we're out of ideas. I don't know.
I'd say that there are two sort of corridors and as artists, I think those that are artists out here would probably relate to this. Some of the stories, as far as the origins of stories and where to pull from, and looking at different sort of cultures and stories and narrative traditions around the world. I think often we draw from what resonates with us in our hearts. That's the creating something on spec kind of thing. You just want to do it. Hamilton. I mean, a brilliant contemporary example of someone's riff on the founders. Beautifully done. Braveheart was a wonderful adaptation that was in the heart of Randall Wallace, the screenwriter. Beautifully adapted, 800-year-old story. And Shakespeare himself, in creating wonderful works, Henry VIII and Richard II, Richard III, and Macbeth, he drew on older narratives through the chronicles, but then of course he personalized those because he wanted to. And he wanted to deliver these to the theater that, of course, he had a close relationship with. And so my story is a post-Civil War story, and I'm very passionate about that story, very eager to put this on screen and excited. But at the same time, the reality is if you're an artist, there's craft, and that means sometimes you just get a gig and you got to deliver, And it's just like you get a gig, you got to pay the bills. And so like Tchaikovsky, music is a huge reference of mine, he desperately tried to get out of composing the Nutcracker. And his letters exist to the head of the ballet company. He's like, I want out of this. This is, Act 2 is horrible. And, they wouldn't let him out of this. So he just delivered. And then, of course, it's the Nutcracker, right? Because he had craft. And the 1812 Overture, Tchaikovsky as well, he dissed his own work. It was a commission he got. And he's like, I got to do this thing. I have no passion for this at all. And, a patroness of his said, don't do it, turn it down. He's like, I already vomited it out, basically, to use my language. Yeah. And it's the 1812 Overture. It's just craft. Delivered that. So it's stuff that's birthed out of our heart because of something that touches us in that culture. Maybe a magazine article that we read. Saturday Night Fever came out of a magazine article, and it's birthed out of us. Other times it's having to keep food on the table, and your craft then we'll deliver a great, great feast. And that's a reality as well. And I really sort of marvel at that dichotomy of sort of experiences from an artist's perspective.
Yeah, I think underlying what you're saying, I think the point I get out of it is you still try to bring something to the table, whatever process that you're working at, something that you still like and still something that you enjoy. No matter if, even if it's just a gig to pay the bills, you're still trying to bring something forward that, okay, I don't really like this. I mean, I really don't want to be working on this, but here's what I'm bringing to the table. Here's what I can contribute. Here's what I like. So there's still that core element of like bringing yourself forward and putting yourself into the project.
Yeah, because at the same time, that was somebody else's big idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
At the end of the day. So it's a way to look at it, because you're right. I kind of try to like one for you, one for them, in terms of picking projects, because at the end of the day, yes, you need to put food on the table. But there's opportunity there when you're, I don't want to say less invested, but if it's somebody else's big idea because if I have a big idea, I'm usually not sleeping for quite a long time. If it's somebody else's that I'm helping them execute, I'm just applying myself in a slightly different way. And so a lot of my energy isn't in the dark cave writing. It's, this is what we're going to go with. This is exciting to you. I can get excited about this. I can put a lot more of my energy toward implementing things. To me, it's almost like practice in a way, right? What's something I can try to do? I didn't really want to do a rom-com, but this is very interesting. How can I bring sort of my style, my tone to this, and find the parts that I do get excited? Because as we've seen, there's so many different types of content, down to a handful of seconds on your phone to just these huge blockbusters. So I think finding something that you get excited about and remembering that it's somebody else's big idea is a good way to get better at your craft and try new things and help somebody else execute. So
That was a brilliant wrap-up, actually. It brought everything together. Thank you. We're coming to the end of our hour. Are there any questions from anybody in the audience for any panelists? Yes, sir.
I guess my question is about maybe you're stuck and like you're trying to come up with that idea, or you have an idea and it's not growing. Like, do you have techniques for overcoming that, or like knowing when to abandon something, or like just overcoming maybe a story, or like just techniques on how to overcome?
So that's a great question. The question, just so everybody could hear it, is if you get stuck on an idea, how do you break through that, or how do you know it's time to walk away and do something new?
I would say in my
We're all
experience,
thinking about
I'm
when
ready
that's
to jump in. I'm ready to jump
I
in.
would say in my
Yeah.
experience, and this may not sound like great advice, but put it away. Put it in the drawer. Let it just stop thinking about it. Stop thinking about it, and then at some point you'll know when to go back to it and take a look at it, and another idea will spawn. Something will come like, oh, you know what, this was really great, or no, this wasn't really great, and here's how I want to change it now. Put it aside. Work on other things. Work on other ideas, and then come back to it.
That's key. And another thing I want to add to that is because one, it's going to happen. I think to everybody if it's something you're pursuing. But one thing that I do is I'll go and practice. I keep saying my craft, but like I'll practice how I would execute that story in different ways, so that when I do wake up at 3 a.m. and I've cracked the code. I think I've cracked the code on breaking the back on that story. I'm ready to go. So that's not, it's a combination of stepping away, but for me it can be as simple as like stocking up on groceries, cleaning my workspace, getting like, it sounds like busy work. It sounds like you're like kind of hiding from it, but for me, I want to make sure everything is ready to go, so that when I'm ready to create, I don't need to go and buy the laptop, or I don't need to go and, it's like I'm ready and I'm ready to get shot out of the cannon. That's the type of thing that just keeps my sanity a little bit, because I know that when the time comes, I won't have any excuses to sort of like, I think you said, somebody mentioned vomit it all out. It's just like when it's ready to come out, I want to be prepared for that. And it might not happen for a long time, but I think the key is to just be ready, so that when it does happen, you can hopefully, catch that lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, to go, I love what you're saying, and to go along with that, a lot of times I feel that when I'm not able to execute the idea how I want is when I'm really overthinking it. I'm in a space where I'm overthinking, and I need some clarity in whatever way that gives you the most clarity. Calling a friend, maybe doing a workout, doing some yoga. Any way to give you a little bit more clarity so that when you go back into your space, you're a little more relaxed, you have a fresher perspective. So that's a big one for me. Any way to get some clarity and get yourself back into a more relaxed, intuitive space.
Awesome, wonderful. We are getting kicked out.
We are getting kicked out.
Thank you all. This is a wonderful audience. Thanks to my panelists, and have a great con.